This is Connor, you're watching the JavaScript Mastery series, and in this video we are going to be covering everything we need to know about functions to get our blue belt in JavaScript. So to begin with, we're going to be looking at the big picture of functions, right? What are they? Why do we use them? And how do they improve our code base? Then after that, we're just going to be looking at creating functions and the different ways of creating functions. Then we're going to move on to another way of creating functions, but it's going to get its own segment because we do need to discuss it in more detail, and that is arrow functions. We're going to be looking at those and how they're different to regular functions. We will take a look at arguments and what we pass into functions and allow us to use functions more dynamically, and we'll be looking at some tricks and tips around those and making sure you know everything you need to know about them. Finally, we are going to take a look under the surface and see how functions behave just like objects because they are objects. So let's get started. So functions are blocks of code that we can execute whenever we want and whenever we want to. So sometimes we don't necessarily want to have to execute all of our code in our application as soon as the app starts, right? As soon as the application starts. Sometimes we only want to make something happen when the user something or something happens and we're responding to an event. So maybe if you look at like Flappy Bird, for example, you might not want the bird to start jumping as soon as the game starts, right? We want to make the bird jump as soon as the user touches the screen or presses the spacebar button. So we want to execute that block of code in response to an event, right? And that's how functions work. Also, we can take a block of code and put it into a function so we can reuse it in different places. This prevents us from having to duplicate code all over our code base and have to manage the same thing in lots of different places. Instead, we can just have one block of code where that can be reused for our code base, and if we need to make any changes, we only have to make changes to that one place. And as well as that, with functions we can pass in arguments. This allows us to do the same thing with slightly different configuration or different settings. Maybe when we make that bird jump when we're playing Flappy Bird, perhaps we have multiple different birds and we want the bird to jump different heights. We could pass in a parameter, right? We're still going to do all of the same thing, but we're going to make the bird jump different heights based on the character, and that way, instead of having to write multiple blocks of code for different characters, we can just use the same one but use arguments to pass in slightly different configuration to make that block of code slightly more flexible and serve more purposes. So functions, they make our code base more organized, easier to read, easier to maintain, and more flexible. So there are multiple different ways we can create functions in JavaScript. What you might call the regular or default way is by using a function declaration, and this is by literally just typing the function keyword. Maybe we say jump. Okay, so this is a function declaration. We see a simple function keyword followed by the name of the function with these braces. And we will execute all of the code inside of this statement, and whenever we want to invoke that, we can just call that function with these braces to invoke it to actually execute the code. Now, a key thing to understand with function declarations in JavaScript is that functions are hoisted. Now, this in a nutshell means we can actually call this function before it appears in the code, which sucks, right? But so let's say we have no create here, and you see that jump that got called, but interestingly we can actually call this function before it was created. Now the reason for this is something called hoisting. Now we're not going to dive into hoisting right now because we have covered it in a lot of detail in the previous video where we talked about declaring variables. So if you need to understand hoisting, what it is and how it works, I would recommend going back and checking out that video. It is an important concept and you do need to know it at this level if you want to get your blue belt in JavaScript. Now, as with all types in JavaScript, we can use a function constructor, right? So we've seen how we can create strings and numbers using these function invocations. We can also do the same thing with functions. We can use function constructors to create functions. Now, these do not look too pretty. So new function. Then we're going to pass in the name of the function. Let's call it run. We've already called it. And then I'm going to use console.log run. Now, as you can see, look, JavaScript allows us to use function invocations to create all of its different types. Here, it really looks ugly and it's hard to read, as you can see for yourself. You know, we have to pass the parameters and the bodies in as strings. This is rarely used in practice, but there is some specialized use cases where you may want to kind of create a function and execute it using some kind of code, like stringified code that you want to pass into a function. Now, this could be the use case if you're doing something like, you know, you've got an online coding editor, you want to stringify all of that user code and inject it into a function. That's something you could use it for, or doing something with some kind of test engine. You know, you're testing a block of code and you want to execute it, pass that string into a function. Apart from those one-off use cases, there's not really any upsides to creating a function like this. It's actually slower and has performance issues as well as being less readable. So stay away from that unless, you know, you have a specific use case for actually using it. Now, we got function expressions. So we got jump, we got run, let's call one called duck. Now this is going to be a function like this. And when we call it, we are going to duck, and we can call it just the same, run, jump, duck. What's the purpose of a function expression? Well, you see here, we've created the function, but the function doesn't really have a name, but it's assigned to a variable that does have a name. Now, this can be useful if you want to pass a function around your code base. So you might want to pass this function duck into another function, for example. So let's say we've got this function process action. Now, should this action be executed? Well, it's going to depend on this parameter, but if we should, we're going to call action. This action here is passed in as a parameter. So here we got this function process action, and it receives a parameter which is actually a function. So if we want to pass this function in as a parameter to another function, then it's going to need to pass it in as a variable, right? And this is where function expression could be useful. As you can see, this function is assigned to this variable, and this process action could receive the variable duck, which is a function, as a variable. So let's just say should execute, and based on a condition, action skipped, so we didn't execute it. Now if we assign this to true, duck, it executed this function inside of another function. So whenever you want to pass in a function as a parameter, then you could indeed use a function expression. And because you've assigned it to a variable that's either const or let, we could avoid that function from being hoisted, and we wouldn't actually be able to use that function before it's called. So let's see what happens here. We get an error, cannot use access duck before initialization, because we assigned it to a const, which now I'm not going to dive into. It is still technically hoisted, but we can't use it. Reason for it, now to understand why, again, it's due to the way const is hoisted and the special behavior between the const and the let and how they are hoisted. So if that's a confusing concept, again, I recommend going back, checking out that earlier video when we discussed variable declaration to really understanding hoisting, because it is super important. Another place where function expressions can be useful is in callbacks. So with a callback, if let's say we have an event, okay, and this event is going to call a function off the back of it. That event could be the user click the screen or press the spacebar and we want the bird to jump. Now in these circumstances, or in some of these scenarios, we may only be using this function in the one place and we don't need to be able to call it from anywhere else. So it could make sense to use a function expression so we can just use it in line without the ability for anything else to be able to call it, because it's only going to be called in this one place by this one event. So just a rough example, right? We may have some kind of game. We may have this document event listener and we're listening for key down, and when key down happens we're going to listen to this function, and we want this function to specifically only be used when the user has clicked the key down. So of course there's no reason to call this function anywhere else, so we don't need to give this a name, right? We don't need this to be called anywhere else. So in this specific example it could make sense to use a function expression, because we don't need that function to have a name, as we are just using it in line and it's not going to be called anywhere else. Now the other way we can create a function in JavaScript is using an arrow function. Now that deserves its own segment. So arrow functions were introduced in ES6 and they've been around for about a decade, and it's important that you really understand them. So first thing to note is that arrow functions were not introduced to directly replace function declarations, but they can be used to replace function declarations in almost every single use case where we're not making use of something called the this keyword. Don't worry, we'll get into that. So what was the point of arrow functions and why are they different? So the first thing to note is that arrow functions offer a more concise and clean syntax. They're slightly shorter, nicer on the eyes to read, and they definitely look great when we are doing something with it, like a small function or some kind of utility. So maybe if we had some kind of add functionality, small utility function, and when the return statement is in one line, we can omit out the braces and the return statement. And as you can see, this definitely is going to look a lot nicer and a lot cleaner than doing this. So that's the first key difference. They offer a more concise syntax, especially for smaller functions, and especially with a function that doesn't just returns the one statement with no complex logic. We can omit out the return statement and those braces. So maybe I have player scores and maybe I just want to get out the high score. As you can see, a lot of the times it makes sense to use the arrow functions on. And then, because of it's just a one-line statement with no logic above it, we could just omit the statement out. And it looks super clean and super impressive. Now, apart from just looking pretty, there is another important difference between the function declaration and the arrow function, and that is with the behavior of something called the this keyword. Now, arrow functions do not bind their own this. They inherit the this from the surrounding scope. Function declarations create their own this. Now, in scenarios where you want to use the surrounding this keyword, arrow functions are a clear winner because they allow you to do just that. Now, understanding how the this keyword works in depth and really understanding it is a concept that's beyond the blue belt. It's quite advanced and quite tricky, probably in my opinion one of the trickiest parts of JavaScript. But we do need to understand enough about the this keyword to understand the difference in the behavior between the function declaration and the arrow function. So we're going to be going into it in just enough detail at this level so you can understand the difference between these two functions. So in this example, we have an object called game. It's got some properties and it has a method called start. Now we have this set timeout. We look at how much time's elapsed and then we say how high score challenge has been running for this time. Now in this example, inside of this function, we need this refers to the outer scope. Now the outer scope is here, we see game, and that's why when we say this, it's referring to game, and was able to access one, the start time here, which is also defined here, and we was also able to access this property name. So what would happen if this was a regular function? Undefined has been running for nan-ms. Now the reason for this is because function binded its own this. This function is now encapsulated to this function, right? But when we use the arrow function, it inherited the this from its outer scope, which belongs to game. So in this example where I wanted the function to be able to access the this keyword from outside of the function itself, I'll need to use an arrow function. And now because this no longer binds its own this, it instead inherits it from its surrounding scope, we can indeed access it. And that is a second key difference. Now there's not many scenarios where you're going to create a function and that function needs to own its own this keyword, whether it's for some reason it's holding its own state or it's containing some of its own properties that it needs, right? So for this reason, in 99% of scenarios, whenever you're creating a function, you can just use an arrow function, right? I mean, as we saw, it's cleaner, shorter, easier to read, and a lot of people do just this. You can read a lot of code bases, maybe you check out some that are open source. You'll see that a lot of people decide just to use arrow functions for absolutely everything, you know, and hey, why not? If I don't need to make use of the this keyword, I could do just that. But should you do that, or should you just use a regular function declaration? Well, the choice is up to you, and it's yours to make based on your preference. Now, me personally, when I'm reading a script, I personally find that the function keywords show a clear, distinct boundary in the code and makes each individual function stand out. So that's why in that scenario, I do actually prefer function declarations. Now, if I have another function within that function, so maybe if I'm using a array method, like doing a map or a find or a filter, and it's already within a clear defined function that stands out, then I prefer to use arrow functions for that particular purpose, right? I mean, I've already got the clear defined function, and now this is just a small utility function within it. So yeah, why not make it slightly prettier, easier to read, and clean? So yeah. Or if I have some kind of callback function, like you saw in the example, it's going to be inline, I'm not going to use it anywhere else, then it can help define the function's purpose by making it an arrow function. So that's my personal preference. I like to use the functions for their intended purpose and why they were created in the first place. I also think it helps relay the intention of the function to other developers as well. But if that's just my personal preference, if you have another style or you prefer the arrow functions, that's up to you, and it's also up to developers that you work with as well, if that's a preference or some kind of pattern that you agreed on. I mean, not worth going to war over. So if that's your style, that's your style, and you know you're not going to cost the business any money because you prefer a particular style over another, right? So yeah, that's my 2 cents. So functions are great for keeping your code tidy and being able to reuse logic. But what really makes a function powerful is the arguments. You see, with arguments, we can allow our function to behave slightly differently based on those arguments that were passed in, to making the function more dynamic based on the input. So imagine you have a character and you want or a car, you want your car to run or drive, whatever, and you have a lot of complicated logic in there to make that happen. Surely you don't want to have to recreate all of that code again for different cars that go at different speeds. What's better is if you could reuse that function but pass in some different parameters to make the car drive slightly slower or slightly faster, or take longer to take off, take longer to slow down. You get the picture, right? We want to do the same thing, but just with different parameters. So we could drive at 50 mile per hour, 40 mile per hour, 20 mile per hour, whatever your preference. Now, the thing that's not very nice when it comes to arguments in JavaScript is what's not nice about JavaScript in general, right? It's loosey-goosey. It lets you do whatever you want, and it's not very strict. And that is what happens with arguments as well. So in this case, you know, what happens if I didn't pass in an argument? Well, you might think, hey, you're going to get an error, right? But yeah, JavaScript doesn't like errors. It likes to do this. But instead, it's just going to make the value undefined. So if you define one parameter, two parameter, or three, and you don't pass those in, all JavaScript is going to do is make those values undefined. Now we got that value, now we've got those two values, and now we see them. The same thing also happens when we pass in too many arguments. So here, what happens when we nothing? JavaScript don't care, right? It just gets ignored. This is really bad, because if we define 3 parameters and this function is expecting 3 parameters, and this function was designed with the expectation that we're going to receive 3 parameters, then for sure we would want there to be an error or some kind of warning or alert that this function has been used incorrectly. But we don't get that. Instead, we just get undefined, which sucks, but it's JavaScript. Now when we want to optionally pass in parameters, we could have default parameters, right? So we know that in 90% of use cases, this function is going to be used. It's going to be 30 mile per hour. We can assign it a default value. So when we call car drive, it's driving at 30 mile per hour, because when we didn't pass in a value for speed, we assigned it a default, and that's what it uses when it doesn't receive any other value. And this is, well, it's better than undefined, and also allows us to use this function without passing in a parameter. If we're going to be using it multiple times, we don't have to keep passing in the same parameter in 90% of those cases, and then we can still pass in a custom parameter if we want to override it. So 30 and now 40. Now one note, when you are using a default parameter and there's multiple parameters, then the default parameter always has to come last. Otherwise, the function is going to get confused. So let's say we have speed, and then we have direction. Now, if we decide, do you know what? Oh wait, let's get rid of that. Now we decide, do you know what? I'm happy with speed being. I want the direction to be left. Let's see what happens. Driving at left mile per hour. Direction is undefined. Because the default parameter is first, when we passed in the one parameter, what happened is it thinks that that's the one that's left, and it is, right? It accepts 2. So the first one was assigned to speed, and it's the last one that's undefined because we didn't pass in a parameter for that one, just the first one. So when we do use default parameters, you got to be careful to make sure they are always last, otherwise you're going to get this unexpected behavior. Now this behavior and this confusion and the need for it to always be last can put people off using default parameters altogether, and it can be slightly confusing. So it's up to you and your preference, but it does exist for a reason. You can utilize it if you want, but it is optional and up to you as a developer as you gain more experience to decide if that's something that you want to utilize. Okay, REST parameters. Now we've seen this spread syntax before when it comes to arrays and objects for spreading those properties. We can also use them in parameters when we want to have more flexibility with our function and allow it to be less strict with the amount of parameters that can be passed in. So here, for example, we can pass in as many items as we want, right? We got this shopping basket total. We want to get the total cost of all the items in those basket. and we can pass in as many items, right? And we're not going to be restricted. We're not going to get any undefines. We're going to be able to pass in as many items as we want into that basket so that it can collect that total. Now, the same thing matters when it comes to direction. If for any reason we decided we wanted a second parameter in here, so maybe we have tax rate is 0.05%, you'll see a rest parameter must be the last parameter. And this is because if it's the first one, JavaScript's going to get confused, right? Because we passed in all of these values here, but which one's going to be the tax rate? Whereas if we was to switch this around, then hey, that parameter is always the first one. Now the funny thing with rest parameters is you can of course you can just make it an array, and you could argue if that was an array, this would be slightly easier to read, right? Rather than passing in all a list of items that are not an array, it just looks slightly strange, and it is hard to distinguish which one is the tax rate and which one are the items. So this could have just easily have been an array, and this here we could just be forced to pass this array in. So yeah, for that reason, a lot of people don't like using rest parameters as well, because you could argue this is slightly easier to read. But whether you want to use them or not use them, it's completely up to you. But it is important to be aware of them, because even if you choose not to use them yourself, you still might need to read the code of someone else that has used them. And of course, you might get asked in a job interview what a default parameter or a rest parameter is. They are a part of the JavaScript language, and it's important to at least know them, be aware of them, regardless if you don't like them or not. Now, one little secret that a lot of people don't know about, but you can actually access the arguments using this keyword. A lot of people haven't seen this before. Now let's make this stand out a little bit so we can see it in our logs. So arguments, boom. As you can see, argument. Let's just call it and not log it. So we're left with a one log, and it's slightly easier to read. As you can see, we've got these arguments here, right? It's a strange looking word. I mean, it almost looks like a global keyword, but it's only accessible within the function itself and belongs to this function. If you try using it outside of the function, it's gonna get it's gonna get like the global arguments with all of this crazy stuff on there. And then obviously when we use it within the function, you just literally getting arguments of that. It's slightly old school. It's slightly older way. That technique, it's like an older way to access all the parameters of a function. It's not recommended to be used today. It's not a real array. It's not very easy to read, and also it's not compatible with arrow functions. Plus, you can, and if you do want to collect all the arguments into an array, you're better off just logging out the arguments or using a rest parameter. But I doubt you would see that in a modern code base. I doubt there's any reason to access the parameters in this way. But hey, it's part of the language, right? And we cover everything. So I just want you guys to be aware of that in case you ever did see it. I doubt anyone would even expect you to know that in a job interview, to be honest. So just to recap, JavaScript allows any number of parameters. If you pass in less or more than expected, you're not going to get an error thrown. Their values are just going to default to undefined, which sucks, but it's what happens when we use loosey-goosey JavaScript. You can use default parameters if you're reusing a function a lot and you find yourself 90% of the time using the same value. You might get use out of that. And then you can use the rest parameters if you want a function to accept any number of arguments that are all being used in the same way, like a list. It's like you're always using a list, but you're just given the option to not use the brackets. So it's up to you whether you like to use it or not. It's up to you, but just be aware of it and know that it exists. And who knows, maybe it will impress the interviewer if you do use it and just demonstrate that you're aware of its existence. I showed you guys that older arguments keyword, not because you should use it, but just because it's there and it's part of the language and we cover everything. but please, I don't see the benefit of using it yourself. But if you do find a benefit of using it and you've used it, let me know, and I'll update the video. And lastly, yeah, just be mindful of the order when you're using those default arguments or REST parameters. JavaScript's weird. It will tell you that the REST parameter should come last. It should really do the same with the default, but it doesn't. But just because it doesn't tell you doesn't mean you should just put it wherever you want. Default values should also come last, or just don't use them. One quirky thing in JavaScript is that functions are objects. Just like arrays are objects, like specialized objects, functions are objects as well. But the weird thing about functions in JavaScript is that when we use the type of operator on a function, it actually says it's actually a function, but it's not. It's an object, but it's like a specialized kind of object. But regardless, it is an object. So let's just say, I don't know, so you got this function. So let's just say, I don't know, car, const, drive car equals function. Yeah, we're going to bring these back. And then I'm going to do console.log drive car. Function drive car. Yeah, if we had, and yeah, if I did function drive car, and then I did, no, so if I had drive car, and I did something like console.log type of drive car, let's see what happens. It says it's a function, right? So even though it says it's a function, it's actually it's an object. Under the hood, it's an object. Now, what does this mean, and why should you even care if it's an object? So because it's an object, there's some quirky behaviors that come with functions, and there's some things that we can do with them. Whether or not you should be able to do what we can with them, and whether or not we should actually do it is another question. But as you can see, functions can have properties and they can have method. So maybe this says jump equals true. Maybe this, you have this. Maybe we even have some kind of, yeah. As you can see, we got all of these properties and methods that we can have that come with a function. Now, what's the point of this? Should we have these functions with properties and methods of their own? Now, the weird thing is, once we start to introduce like properties and methods on functions, the question becomes, well, why not just use an object, or why not just make it a class? Now, classes haven't always existed in JavaScript until recently, and there is a lot of old school code out there where instead of creating classes, people use function invocations to be able to create objects like things with their own properties and methods to kind of simulate object-oriented programming in JavaScript. And even though we now have those class methods that came into JavaScript in ES6, a lot of that is just syntax sugar for function invocation. So if you was to create a class in JavaScript and then you use some kind of transpiler, it's actually just function invocations. Now, a lot of this stuff, a lot of this style, a lot of this stuff where we create properties and methods on functions is a little bit old school, but there is still some quirky use cases for using functions with their own state. Like there is something called I'm not even going to pronounce, I don't know how it's pronounced correctly, but it looks something like, so here you have this like special function where if you're calling multiple things in this function, you could use the properties to create a state on that function to cache some data. So that's one quirky use case where you could do something like this. But for now, at this level, at this blue belt level, just be aware that in JavaScript, anything that's not a primitive is an object. Arrays are objects. So yeah, don't at this level, don't worry about trying to I'm gonna create a function and give it its own properties and methods. That's not really the point. The point is just to be aware that functions are objects and be aware of the behavior that comes with it. Okay guys, so we talked about functions, what they are, why we use them, how they improve our code. Then we looked at the different ways we can create a function, function declarations, function expressions, function invocations. Then when we looked at arrow functions, we looked at those in more detail because they are very popular, they get used a lot. So we went into more detail about those and compared the key differences between function declarations. We looked at arguments. I know you've probably seen those before already, but we looked at some of the bad behavior as around those in JavaScript with those values default into undefined when they're missing. We touched on default parameters, REST parameters, looked at the arguments object. Again, guys, a lot of this stuff you don't have to know to be able to do to be able to achieve an outcome because you don't actually need them. But in certain use cases, they can improve your code. It's just more important that you know they exist in case you see them and you don't get caught off guard. And they also might come up in job interviews. Then we looked at how functions are objects and some of the quirky behavior that can come with that. So that wraps things up. Hopefully, I think just as you gain more experience, you're going to use functions more and more and more to keep your code nice and tidy. And the more you use them, the more experience you gain with them. So yeah, that's a wrap on the functions. I'm sure a lot of this stuff you pick up naturally as you write more code. And hopefully as you gain more experience, you will appreciate functions more and use them more. But yeah, hopefully you got some value out of looking at the difference between arrow functions and function declarations. Because in a lot of code bases, people just seem to use one or the other without really thinking about why they're using that function. Just think about it, know why you're using which particular method, and be consistent. Then yeah, functions are objects. Not many people know that, or they get surprised when they see some quirky behavior. So better to learn now than find out in a job interview and getting tripped up. So that's me. That concludes the Blue Belt series. This was the last video of the Blue Belt series. In the next one, we're going to be going on a more advanced belt. We're going to be progressing on to, what's the next belt? Next belt is going to be the purple belt, where we're going beyond the basics and fundamentals, and we are exploring what parts of JavaScript we need to know to make that journey towards mid-level. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you got any value from it, please like it. It helps the algorithm. And make sure you are subscribed so you get notified when the first video of the Purple Belt series drops. I'll see you guys there.